Welcome back. We will start with lecture 5 today. Till now we have looked at various theories, theoretical positions with respect to the word and rule method as well as the connectionist model. We also looked at the past tense debate and we have also discussed about the blocking hypothesis. So, majority of the most important fundamental ideas within the field of morphology as far as child language acquisition is concerned, we have looked at. Today, we will wrap up this module by discussing on the dual and single root model and the production of inflection. Production as in how children start producing their inflectional morphology, what are the first ones that they start with and how it changes over time, over a period of time. Some small glimpses I will be able to give you within this lecture. Dual and single root model also we have some part of it we have discussed before when we discussed about the word and rule model and compared it with the connectionist model. So, this is in the same line, but this is another way of looking at the same debate and the discussion, hence we are looking at it separately. So, dual root model. The dual root model is also the word and rule model because it is dual due to the word that is one root, the rule that is another root. So, we can talk about it as having two roots, root 1, root 2. Root 1 could be the lexical root, which is that some words, for example, the irregular words are part of a lexical list of words, that is where you have the irregular forms of past tense as well listed. On the other hand, we have root 2, which is the grammatical root, which means that you have the child has the rule in place because it is part of inherent grammar anyway. So, once they figure it out and once it has been tested and analyzed on the input data, that is the other route through which they create various forms like past tense forms. Not only past tense, but others also, as we have already seen. So, these are the two ways for the children to arrive at a particular given form, maybe past tense, maybe other kinds of inflections, various kinds of inflections. So, there are two roots and hence it is called dual root model. Now, root 1, let us look at it a little bit more in detail. Now, root 1 is for producing the irregular words, because we have already seen irregular words. For example, walk becomes walked, but go does not become goed, it becomes went. So, these are irregular words in English language, and this is on the basis of these we had a discussion on the past tense debate in English language in detail. So, this is what we are getting back at, the producing irregular words which are part of the root 1. So, these irregular forms are learned and stored in memory as lexical entries as it is. So, what do we mean by as it is? Then what is stored? When we say this is stored as a lexical entity, what we store is not just one thing, but we store the meaning, we store the pronunciation and the usage. So, the entire information about that lexical entity is stored in the lexical list that we have. These are the listed words. So, when we need to use them, we retrieve the word from memory, if it is possible. Now, there might be a slight problem because sometimes we may not be able to, the children may not be able to retrieve it immediately given a situation. So, there are two ways here as well. So, either you retrieve it as it is directly from the memory, or there is another way that if the correct form is not stored, then we seek help from friends. We have discussed this phonological friends before as well. So, phonological friends are similar sounding past tense forms, let us say. So, these are stored. So, if it is let us say the past tense of throw is not stored, child is not, or even if it is stored, the child is not able to retrieve them, then what their mind does is it looks for another form which is similar and which might be stored. Provided it is stored, then the child will have an easy task. So, they will just copy the the system and they will follow the rule, follow that kind of a route. So, if the through is not there, then they will take help from the past tense form of blow, which is blew. So, they will be able to use the word through. So, blow becomes blew, so throw becomes through, that kind of a thing. So, route 1 is gives you two options, either direct access to stored form or through analogy. Through analogy means through the phonological friends. So, if this is the similarity, then this could also be utilized for let us say entity number x. Now, the route 2, which is the grammatical form, that is also something we have discussed before. Grammatical form as in there are rules of forming past tense in English language, forming present continuous tense in English language and so on. So, these are rules that you already have. Now, if you want to arrive at a particular tense marking or particular aspect marking or whatever, then you just apply the rule to that root form. So, as a result of which these are not stored as lexical items. So, these are you do not need to store them basically. So, they are created by applying the rule on the morphological rule on the root word. So, we retrieve the verb stem from the memory and then add the suffix. So, we retrieve the verb memory like say for walk, and then we use the rule that you already know, and then we create the past tense form. So, this is how we go. So, this is supposed to be a very productive way of creating words, very productive way of getting to the complex morphological structures, and that is why it has been called a mental production line. So, that puts words together at the time of speaking. So, just as when you are about to speak, this kind of a mechanism happens behind the scene, and thereby you have your word. So, these are the two kinds of roots that the dual root hypothesis talks about. Now, we have already seen before, we have used the word over regularization as well as over generalization. This is a persistent problem with respect to children acquiring morphology in the initial stages at least. So, they tend to over generalize. So, the rule they have learned, they will be applying for every other possible verb. So, why does it happen? We have discussed this before as well with respect to past tense. So, we will go over this in a very in short. So, explain how does dual root hypothesis explain over generalization or over regularization. So, this has the following explanation, because first and foremost the irregular verbs need to be learned separately, because remember they are part of the lexical list. So, if they have to be memorized as it is each word. So, this is going to take them some time, or at least they have to have some of the phonological friends. So, even if the entire list is not there yet, but at least some of them should be there in order to function as the similar sounding friends or the phonological friends. Now, till that happens, obviously none of these things happen overnight. So, when till this happens, children apply rules, because that seems to be the easier way out. So, this is how dual root hypothesis explains over generalization, because the irregular forms are to be learned separately. Hence, till that happens, we are using the rules. So, that is one. And then when the irregular forms are learnt, but the child fails to retrieve it from memory, this is another case where there might be the use of over generalization, the use of the rules where they do not apply. Now, there are many studies that have found proof for this theory, or let us say they support the hypothesis. One of the more well known ones is by Marcus et al. So, children they have found in their study that children start to make over generalization error at almost the same time when they start to use regular past tense ending. Regular past tense ending, we mean the ed ending. So, which is the rule based past tense formation in English language. So, as soon as they start to use the rule based form, that is also the time they start to over generalize. So, this neatly falls within the hypothesis that before they have learned the irregular forms as lexical entities, they will use the rules. So, this is something that supports this data supports that idea. Over regularization errors were also significantly more for low frequency irregular verbs. This is also something that is that the dual root hypothesis takes care of, that frequency does play a role. So, the high frequency words will be learned faster, low frequency words will be learned later, as a result of which the errors will be more in low frequency. So, that is again a support that you get support from this finding. The errors were less with words that had similar sounding friends. Again another hypothesis that the dual root says is that you take help from the phonological friends. So, if you have phonological friends, the errors will be less. So, that also gets supported. So, the main three propositions of the dual root hypothesis seems to be supported by the findings. Not only this particular study, but there are many other studies that have found similar kind of result. But that does not mean that there are not no problems, there are problems and they have been put forward as well. So, for example, one particular issue is that the defaulting to one particular inflection does not seem to always work. What does this mean? In many languages, for example, in English, the past tense marker is only ed. There are, of course, there are irregular forms, but in terms of rule there is ed. Now, here it is easy to say that till they learn the irregular form, they will continue to use ed. Now, what happens in languages where there are more than one marker for one particular purpose? There might be more than one marker for past tense, there might be more than one marker for plural and so on and so forth. In that case, what will happen? Will they default to only one, which is the expectation is even if you have more than one marker, the defaulting will be on the most commonly utilized, that is the majority the time whatever you use for the majority of the time, that is what we will be expecting them to do. However, it does not always work that way. Some languages, for example, German has more than one plural marker. Okay. So, there are these two markers in German, which both of them mark plural. Now, children were found to overgeneralize more than one of these, and that too they were using this the S, the sub marker more often than the en marker. So, and the sub marker is not even the majority marker. So, the theory does not seem to quite answer for this, because there is more than one marker and then the theory does not say as to which marker would be preferred as the default marker till the irregular forms are learned. So, this is one case from German. Similarly, Polish children were found to overgeneralize all the three. So, Polish has three possessive markers. So, possessive markers as in my book, so Ram's book, like that. So, or Raj's house. So, these are possessive markers. So, in Polish there are three ways of marking possession. So, genitive singular inflection, for example, can be marked by these three types of inflections. So, the same idea of genitive marker in case of singular form. So, there are three inflections possible, and what they found was a similar kind of thing, that all the three possessive markers were overgeneralized. So, there was no defaulting to one particular inflection that the children followed. That was one problem. Problem number 2 was that errors were not trivial, errors were quite high. Because the dual root hypothesis does give some room, does make some room for errors, some problems, because still the children are figuring out the irregular forms and all that, but they do not predict a very high error rate. Of course, error rates are expected. So, initial studies, some of the studies reported very low error rate, say 3% or something. However, some other researchers looked at the errors one by one individually, and then they found that though on the average it might be toward the lower side, individually if you look, then the errors are pretty high. So, a number of studies have pointed out that sometimes the children's inflectional morphology errors will be somewhere around 50% or even more. Now, this is quite high, even taking into account the error, the margin that the hypothesis allows. Finally, the phonological friends are said to aid in avoiding error, right. So, when you do not have, if you have not yet memorized that particular irregular form, then you look for the phonological friend and you get by. So, basically phonological friends are there to help, not to hinder, but some studies found that the phonological friends might be hindered, might be hindering the other rule governed phenomena. For example, one particularly important study reported that past tense rule can be sensitive to phonological similarity. So, if you have, this was a very interesting study with the methodology was quite interesting. You may look up the paper. So, they used a 4-way difference taking into both of these variables, the phonological similarity and the rule, and there was a 4-way distinction that they created in the stimuli, and thereby they showed how children actually how past tense rule also was sensitive to phonological similarity, which should not be happening. The hypothesis does not make any room for this kind of problem. It is only supposed to help in case of irregular words. So, these are problems with the dual root hypothesis that have been pointed out. Now, let us move to the single root hypothesis. This hypothesis again, if you recall, we have discussed it in connectionist model with Rumelert and McClelland theory, which is called RMM model. So, RMM model talks about only one root, one single root. So, this is the similar root, which is the root number 1 for our dual root hypothesis, which is the lexical root. So, what basically this means is that all there is no need for a rule to be there in the first place. All the forms are stored as lexical entries, past tense forms or whatever forms, they all are stored as lexical entries, whether they are irregular or regular, and they are directly retrieved in the finished form. So, when the retrieval fails, similar sounding words come to the rescue like the older ones. So, you do not need to learn the rules to apply to certain kind of, you will look for the root and then apply the rule to the root and get your relevant form. That is not how this theory proposes. It says that all entries are lexical entries. The most interesting part of this hypothesis is that all past tense forms are stored this way. Now, whether they are regular or irregular, all are there in the lexical storage. Now, the demonstration of this came from a computer program, which is also something we have discussed before. So, the program was created in such a way that they did not give any input of a rule there, only some inputs were given without without any kind of a rule. So, the words are there and the system has to learn from the given words about how the past tense form works. So, the system was found to learn and produce past tense without any grammatical rules. Word stems were fed into the system and it associated with the sounds of its past tense. So, it was because this is connectionist models, it is it is based on association of phonological form across the words. So, thereby they figure it, the system figures out the past tense of whichever is the past tense of whichever verb. So, the model generated phonologically based links between words, that was the hypothesis, and the model seemed to work perfectly in line with the hypothesis. Data in real life also with respect to children, data do reveal that children associate phonological properties while inflecting for tense. So, the model also answers other questions about overgeneralization of errors and delays. However, there are some very interesting criticism coming from the Pinker group. So, in one of the most well known criticisms comes from Pinker and Prince 1988. They put forward many issues, but among them three issues stand out. So, for example, their first problem was that the model was created by cheating in the input system. So, they said that the model was given different input in different stages, thus cheating their way to the results. So, the results were arrived at because the input were given in such a way that it will give you that kind of a result. It was not very honest. That is one. Second was, of course, it is a long discussion, it is a very rather lengthy paper. I encourage you to go read that, it is very interesting and very well argued, but this is the gist of the matter. So, they say that input is the problem, the way the input was created and the stage in which the input was given is what resulted into what we see as the output. So, secondly, the model cannot explain the minority default behavior. Minority default is what we discussed in terms of the German language, where the inflection which is not the most common one was defaulted on. Well, that is where the children defaulted, taking it as the default system. So, that is called minority default. So, minority default behavior cannot be explained by this particular theory, and also no explanation for homophones. So, this is another problem, because why is homophone important? Because that entire theory is based on the phonological association, right. So, the system is associating words with their past tense forms. So, the word to word connection is based on the sounds, the phonological part. So, homophones automatically then will be a big contender to be contesting for the same position. So, how does the system take care of this is also not very clear. So, these are the most important criticism of the single root hypothesis. So, this is about dual and single root hypothesis with respect to learning the inflectional morphology. So, these are debates that need to be looked at from the perspective of the papers themselves. There are n number of papers you can look up. So, today as a result of all of these debates and discussions, now both single root and dual root models have been updated many times, and as a result of which we have many of these criticisms have been factored in the newer models. So, now we have now the situation is of course better, because most of the criticism that Pinker and his group have also been taken into account in the later models of the single root hypothesis. So, of course, the latest models have many of the things taken care of. So, that is what about our single and dual root model. We will complete this lecture with some examples of children's production of inflections. Of course, that is what we have been discussing, but from a theoretical perspective. Now, let us see how what are the kinds of morphemes that they start with, and some insights into that. So, let us start with grammatical morphemes. Children's first attempt at using grammatical morphemes like determiners in English, they attempt it sporadically. Initially, they do not use it everywhere. In fact, some scholars have pointed out that they seem to use a vowel, kind of a neutral vowel, schwa sort of a sound, or a syllabic na sound. So, you know, I am not sure whether they are actually using it as a determiner, or they are just using it as a kind of a placeholder. So, this is how they start the use of grammatical morpheme. In case of English, that has been studied with respect to determiners. It is not sure even when they are using a schwa sound or a na sound before the noun, whether it is a determiner or not, that is not clear. They use the same kind of sound also in case of prepositions. So, one example I have quoted here. So, there, so you do not know whether it is in there, on there, or it is simply a placeholder. But this is how the grammatical morphemes with respect to English language tends to appear. Around 2.5 or 3 years, they are able to use the and a like adults. So, now the determiners are properly shaped in pronunciation, as well as they are able to kind of they start using them, but the appropriateness of the usage takes a little bit more time for it to be perfected. So, for example, they are found to overuse definite form, where indefinite form would be appropriate. So, for them to even though they start using it by 2.5–3 years, the perfecting the usage takes a little bit more time. As many studies have pointed out, these are older, but there are newer studies also similar kind of finding. Number marking again in English. So, plural markers are among the earliest grammatical morphemes to be acquired, and this also coincides with the vocabulary burst around age 2, but their comprehension of plurality again takes a bit of a time. So, they start using it just like the determiner or the preposition, this also number marking also, but for them to understand the plurality, the concept of plurality often is based on an additional information in the phrase. For example, those cats, 2 cats, like this. Only cats are not apparently very helpful for them to get the plurality, the aspect of plurality very clearly. Inflectional morphemes using, for example, noun inflection and verb inflections, noun to noun, noun inflections to noun, verb inflections to verb. First and foremost requires them to understand what is a noun and what is a verb. So, we have discussed this elsewhere. The distributional properties of the child directed speech seem to help children in this the parsing the continuous speech into what is noun and what is verb. What is noun in the beginning? The idea of noun is very clear, very simple. The meaning and form are correlated. So, nouns are objects, nouns are people, and verbs are actions, like that. So, it is very simple and very directly correlated kind of a mapping. So, meaning and form are directly correlated. So, as a result, children assign preliminary meaning to unfamiliar terms using this method. But from 3 to 5 years, they are able to use nouns and verbs in the respective meaning category and are able to infer part of speech information from inflections used with nonsense syllables and are generally consistent with their use of inflections. These three are very important learning stages, because they are able to, because initially they are dependent on the lexical entry itself, but for them it takes a little bit of time to generalize, to abstract the idea of noun inflection to be used with every kind of noun. It is not like they have to memorize each and every noun and each and every verb like that. So, they arrive at this idea a little later than 3 years of age, and then over around that time they also are able to infer part of speech meaning, which is the noun, which is the verb, and what is depending on the inflection that are utilized, they are able to point out the object in real life. So, this has been studied using nonsense syllables, and they are also generally consistent with their use of inflection. So, they figure out what is to be used where and they get the flow. So, in a rather well known study, which is a follow up study of Brown we have referred to many times in this lecture, in this module. So, in a follow up study from Brown, one particular study used nonsense words and pictures to elicit their comprehension of inflection. So, they are using nonsense words and they have attached that nonsense word to the unfamiliar object which the child does not know. So, basically using a novel form and meaning mapping, and they were trying to see if through the use of inflection the child is able to point out the signified the object. So, they heard the nonsense word and picked up the correct unfamiliar object for both singular and plural cases. So, these are some examples of the stimuli that was used. So, do you know what a dash is? This dash could be any of those nonsense words, and then in this picture you can see so again they are familiarizing the child with this kind of a term and then asking, can you show me another picture with a dash in it? So, now the child has to figure out that this word with a an inflection, for example, here we have this now they have to understand, they have to connect it with the noun, that okay, this refers to a noun, it is not a verb that we are talking about. Similarly, for plural markers as well. So, do you know what? So, there here you have s, which is a plural marker. So, again they have to point to the plural object that is in the picture. So, this is how they found out that children are able to from the nonsense words, from the kind of inflectional morphology used, they are able to figure out which is a noun, which is a verb. In the use of inflections, they tend to be selective. For example, both in case of verbs as well as in case of nouns, they start very carefully, let us say. So, that is what we mean by selective. So, in case of in a study on English speaking children, what they found out was they tend to use ing, which is the progressive marker, with activity verbs like run. Now, the verbs in English language have been categorized into different types. So, activity verb is one kind, then there is achievement or accomplishment verb, there are stative verbs, all kinds of things. So, the children were found to use the ing marker predominantly or say selectively with the activity verbs like run, but they were not using them with other verbs like break or build. These are also verbs, but these are of a different category. These are called accomplishment or achievement verbs. They were not using the ing marker with these verbs. Similarly, they also did not use ing with stative verbs like want, know and so on. So, then thus children, very young children are found to be able to differentiate verbs into categories. So, only action verbs are are selected for using the ing marker. This probably is because as we have discussed this elsewhere also, this happens probably because in the initial vocabulary of children, initial dialogue or initial conversation with children typically focus on here and now, whatever is happening there. So, as a result of which more words like playing, running, all action verbs are more common in the child's vocabulary as well as in the child directed speech. Probably that is the reason why they tend to use ing only with those verbs initially. Of course, over a period of time they change, but this is how the beginning happens. And similarly, similar kind of selective behavior is found only also with nouns. For example, there were very interesting studies, cross linguistic study as well. So, Latvian, Russian, Polish, English and other languages have been studied. So, what they found, a couple of studies that I have reported here. So, initially they use initial inflection focusing on each noun, focusing on the noun, what the noun is, and accordingly they will use. So, they have not arrived at the rule yet. Once they start to understand the rule, that is the meaning, for example, let us say the case marking. So, this is how this particular noun can be used in a case marked position. So, for example, the knife, I cut apple with a knife. So, knife in this in some languages there will be an instrumental case marking applied to the word knife, because knife is the instrument in those cases. So, in these languages what they found was, once the child has understood the case marking and have been they understood how the meaning of the case marking works, they tend to use those words only with those case markings, not without them. So, for example, instrumental nouns as in nouns that can be used as instrumental. So, instrumental nouns were used only with instrumental case marking. Similarly, the locative nouns like school, kitchen, this kind of nouns were used only with locative case marking. Plural marking is limited to only nouns of pairs or groups like shoes and blocks. So, kind of a fixed way of looking at it initially. The selective, this is what we mean by selective use of noun morphology as well. So, once you figure out the case marking, which is the case in these studies, case marking or plural marking, once they figured out, then they were using them only like that, not in any other way. So, this is how children start learning these kind of markers. Similarly, acquisition of agreement, this is another interesting domain as far as our inflectional morphology goes. So, there were many studies, again many cross linguistic studies. In a Spanish study, for example, Spanish children as young as 3.7 years were seen using gender marking inflection correctly. Because Spanish has grammatical gender. So, children were found to use those inflections correctly. Children acquiring French, it was observed that attention to both number and gender marking on nouns appear around the age 2. So, you see from a cross linguistic perspective, there is hardly any fixed age bracket where a particular kind of inflection will appear. Of course, this is dependent on a number of factors, which again we have discussed in another module. For example, how unambiguous the language is and so on. So, Spanish children learn to use gender marking inflection at 3.7 years, whereas French children learn both number and gender at age 2. Subject verb agreement marking on verbs, however, appear a little late. That is because verb and verb inflections are typically later than the noun and noun inflections. Probably that is how it happened here as well. However, data from English suggests that their full comprehension of subject verb agreement appear around the age of 6 years. So, you can see how varied the data from different languages are. So, there is a cross linguistic difference in terms of the acquisition of different agreement markers. and then of course, they have to discover the word classes. So, whether it is a noun class, noun or a verb or so whatever. There are many theories within this. Again, there is some theory of syntactic bootstrapping and as well as semantic bootstrapping. Syntactic bootstrapping theory says that children are born with the built in word classes. So, they do not need to learn them. These are some of the basic universal traits. So, every language will have nouns, every language will have verbs. So, this is what they are born with. So, as a result of which this is not a big problem. On the other hand, semantic bootstrapping theory says that children arrive at word classes through conceptual categories and by using distributional properties. So, across contexts, across conversational context, across situations, children see the distributional pattern of certain words, and from that they figure out what is a noun, what is a verb, of course, mapping them on the concepts. So, computational models have been used to look into this as well, and often the result from these modeling studies have showed that it is possible to extract nouns and verbs as in terms of word classes as word classes through distributional analysis itself. So, you do not really need them to be inbuilt, you do not need to be them to be inherent. You can, children can, so that if the model can learn, children probably also can learn. However, this also we have discussed at length in a separate module. So, roughly this is what the entire module is all about. So, to sum up, in this module we looked at some of the foundational aspect of acquiring inflectional morphology by children. Relevant theories have been discussed. So, we have discussed theories as well as some of the important constructs. For example, important debates like past tense debate, the blocking hypothesis and all of that. So, everything has been discussed in brief. So, relevant theories and the some of the foundational aspect, and we also looked at the trajectory of the acquisition. So, in a nutshell, this gives you a very brief overview about the acquisition of morphology as far as child language acquisition is concerned. So, with this we wrap up this module. Thank you very much.